Capital, labor, and efficiency. While everything requires some labor for its production, practically nothing can be produced by labor alone. Farmers need land, taxi drivers need cars, artists need something to draw on and something to draw with. Even a stand-up comedian needs an inventory of jokes, which is his capital, just as hydroelectric dams are the capital of companies that generate electricity. Capital complements labor in the production process, but it also competes with labor for employment. In other words, many goods and services can be produced either with much labor and little capital, or much capital and little labor. When transit workers' unions force bus drivers' pay rates much above what they would be in a competitive labor market, transit companies tend to add more capital in order to save on the use of more expensive labor. Buses grow longer, sometimes becoming essentially two buses with a flexible connection between them, so that one driver is using twice as much capital as before and is capable of moving twice as many passengers. Some might think that this is more efficient, but efficiency is not so easily defined. If we arbitrarily define efficiency as output per unit of labor, as some do, then it is merely circular reasoning to say that having one bus driver moving more passengers is more efficient. It may, in fact, cost more money per passenger to move them as a result of the additional capital needed for the expanded buses and the more expensive labor of the drivers. If bus drivers were not unionized and were paid no more than was necessary to attract qualified people, then undoubtedly their wage rates would be lower, and it would then be profitable for the transit companies to hire more of them and use shorter buses. Not only would the total cost of moving passengers be less, passengers would have less time to wait at bus stops because of the shorter and more numerous buses. This is not a small concern to people waiting on street corners on cold winter days or in high-crime neighborhoods at night. Efficiency cannot be meaningfully defined without regard to human desires and preferences. Even the efficiency of an automobile engine is not simply a matter of physics. All the energy generated by the machine will be used in some way, either in moving the car forward, overcoming internal friction among the engine's moving parts, or shaking the automobile body in various ways. It is only when we define our goal, moving the car forward, that we can regard the percentage of the engine's power that is used for that task as indicating its efficiency, and the other power dissipated in various ways as being wasted. Europeans long regarded American agriculture as inefficient because output per acre was much lower in the United States than in much of Europe. On the other hand, output per agricultural worker was much higher in the United States than in Europe. The reason was that land was far more plentiful in the U.S. and labor was more scarce. An American farmer would spread himself thinner over far more land and would have correspondingly less time to devote to each acre. In Europe, where land was more scarce and therefore more expensive because of supply and demand, the European farmer concentrated on the more intensive cultivation of what land he could get, spending more time clearing away weeds and rocks, or otherwise devoting more attention to ensuring the maximum output per acre. Similarly, third world countries often get more use out of given capital equipment than do wealthier and more industrialized countries. Such tools as hammers, screwdrivers may be plentiful enough for each worker in an American factory or shop to have his own, but that is much less likely to be the case in a much poorer country, where such tools are more likely to be shared, or shared more widely, than among Americans making the same products. Looked at from another angle, each hammer in a poor country is likely to drive more nails per year, since it is shared among more people and has less idle time. That does not make the poorer country more efficient. It is just that the relative scarcities of capital and labor are different. Capital tends to be scarcer and hence more expensive in poorer countries. while labor is more abundant and hence cheaper in richer countries. Poor countries tend to economize on the more expensive factor, just as richer countries economize on a different factor that is more expensive and scarce there, namely labor. In the richer countries, it is capital that is more plentiful and cheaper, while labor is more scarce and more expensive. When a freight train comes into a railroad stop, workers are needed to unload it. When a freight train arrives in the middle of the night, it can either be unloaded then and there so that the train can proceed on its way intact, or some boxcars can be detached and left on a siding until the workers come to work the next morning to unload them. In a country where such capital as railroad boxcars are very scarce and labor is more plentiful, it makes sense to have workers available around the clock so they can immediately unload boxcars, and this very scarce resource does not remain idle. But in a country that is rich in capital, it may often be more economical to detach individual boxcars from a train, letting the train continue on its way. Thus, the detached boxcars can sit idle on a siding, waiting to be unloaded the next morning, rather than have expensive workers sitting around idle during the night, waiting for the next train to arrive. This is not just a question about these particular workers' paychecks or this particular railroad company's monetary expenses. From the standpoint of the economy as a whole, the more fundamental question is, what are the alternative uses of these workers' time and the alternative uses of the railroad boxcars? In other words, it is not just a question of money. The money only reflects underlying realities that would be the same in a socialist, feudal, or other non-market economy. Whether it makes sense to leave the boxcars idle, waiting for the workers to arrive, or to leave the workers idle, waiting for trains to arrive, depends on the relative scarcities of labor and capital, and their relative productivity in alternative uses. During the era of the Soviet Union and its Cold War competition with the United States, the Soviets used to boast of the fact that an average Soviet boxcar moved more freight per year than an average American boxcar. But, far from indicating that their economy was more efficient, this showed that Soviet railroads lacked the abundant capital of the American railroad industry, and that Soviet labor had less valuable alternative uses of its time than American labor did. Similarly, a study of West African economies in the mid-20th century noted that trucks there are in service 24 hours a day for 7 days a week and are generally tightly packed with passengers and freight. For similar reasons, automobiles tend to have longer lives in poor countries than in richer countries. Not only does it pay many poorer countries to keep their own automobiles in use longer, it pays them to buy used cars from richer countries. In just 1 year, 90,000 used cars from Japan were sold to the United Arab Emirates. Dubai, one of those emirates, has become a center for the sale of these used vehicles to other Middle Eastern and African countries. The Wall Street Journal reported many African cities are already teeming with Toyotas, even though very few new cars have been sold there. In Cameroon, the taxis are beaten-up old Toyotas carrying 4 in the back and 3 in the front. Even cars needing repairs are sold internationally. Quote, Japan's exporters also ship out thousands of cars that have been dented or damaged. Mechanics in Dubai can repair vehicles for a fraction of the price in Japan, where high labor costs make it one of the world's most expensive places to fix a car. By and large, it pays richer countries to junk their cars, refrigerators, and other capital equipment in a shorter time than it would pay people in poorer countries to do so. Nor is this a matter of being able to afford waste. It would be a waste to keep repairing this equipment, when the same efforts elsewhere in the Japanese economy, or the American economy, or German economy, would produce more than enough wealth to provide replacements. But it would not make sense for poorer countries, whose alternative uses of time are not as productive, to junk their equipment at the same times when the richer countries junk theirs. The fact that labor is cheaper in Dubai than in Japan is not a happenstance. Labor is more productive in richer countries. That is one of the reasons why these countries are more prosperous in the first place. The sale of used equipment from rich countries to poor countries can be an efficient way of handling the situation for both kinds of countries. In a modern industrial economy, many goods are mass-produced, thereby lowering their production costs, and hence prices, because of economies of scale. But repairs on those products are still typically done individually, by hand, without the benefit of economies of scale, and therefore relatively expensively. In such a mass production economy, repeated repairs can, in many cases, quickly reach the point where it would be cheaper to get a new, mass-produced replacement. The number of television repair shops in the United States has therefore not kept pace with the growing number of television sets, as mass production has reduced television prices to the point where many malfunctioning sets can be more cheaply replaced than repaired. A book by two Russian economists, back in the days of the Soviet Union, pointed out that in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, equipment is endlessly repaired and patched up, so that the average service life of capital stock in the USSR is 47 years, as against 17 in the United States. They were not bragging, they were complaining.